Day 5 of the 2024 U.S. Senior and U.S. Junior Championships saw some huge results as we crossed the halfway mark of the tournament. Let's get into the action. In the U.S. Senior, Grandmaster Vladimir Akopian extended his lead after defeating GM Jesse Kraai. Akopian now has 4.5 out of 5, with GM's Larry Christiansen and Julio Becerra 1.5 points behind on 3. In the U.S. Junior, top seed Grandmaster Christopher Yu grabbed the sole lead after defeating IM Jason Liang in today's round. Meanwhile, his key rivals could not keep up, with Justin Wang making a draw against Balaji Daggupati and Andy Woodward losing to Andrew Hong. Christopher now leads with 4 out of 5, a half point ahead of Justin, who is still on 3.5. Finally, in the U.S. Girls Junior, tournament leader Jasmine Su lost for the first time in the event to Omya Vidyarthi, allowing top seed IM Alice Lee to close the distance with a win over Chloe Ga. Jasmine continues to lead with 3.5 out of 5, with Lee, Iris Mu, and Rose Atwell just a half point behind on 3, going into tomorrow's rest day. Jumping into the games, we'll start with Vladimir Akopian's key win over Grandmaster Jesse Kraai in the U.S. Senior, starting with knight f3 and opting for a neo-Catalan setup. It turns out white did get an advantage early on in this game. After this tricky move queen to b3, black played the natural move c5, but this is likely already an inaccuracy. According to the theory, rook to b8 here is supposed to be doing better for black. After c5 a4, black is not able to get b6 in time because of moves like knight to d4, for example, opening up the diagonal and looking for knight to c6. Because of that, after bishop e7, white is able to establish the script with a5 and already achieve a fairly pleasant position. In the game after queen c7, castles rook b8, bishop f4 provoking e5, which weakens a lot of light squares in black's position. Vladimir drops back with bishop to d2. Now b5 is played, otherwise very difficult for black to develop the light squared bishop. But after b5 takes and queen drops back, of course black is left with some long-term structural weaknesses. Vladimir's play in this game was quite nice, as he brings out all of his pieces, and black's position here becomes very, very difficult with basically no active play. Rook a3, now white continues to build up the pressure, bringing the rooks to the queen side. Ideas of knight a3, knight to b5, very annoying for black. h6, black did manage to trade off a pair of pieces here, and after bishop g2, rook e6, very nice transition from white to go bishop h3, trading off the light square bishops and playing e4, leaving black again with a very difficult position with the worst minor pieces, and of course a lot of weaknesses to defend. Jesse tried to hold on to this one as best he could, rook to b8, queen a8, but white's advantage here just continues long term, almost regardless of which pieces get traded here. For queen c3, the bishops come off, and again white's advantage here simply continues to grow, as black has too many weak pawns to defend. After queen's a3, now one of black's pawns is falling here. White takes on a6. The rooks come off, but again white keeps a big advantage. After king e7, the game concluded here, queen h8, king f6, knight to g4, threatening knight d5 and knight g4 check. Black tried queen to d6, but now the nice little tactical finish. Queen takes g7, with a pseudo queen sack. After king takes, white will have knight f5 check. King will have to move, white wins back the queen, and ends up with 2 extra pawns in a knight endgame, in a completely winning position. So with this win, Akopian extends his lead in the U.S. Senior. He now leads by 1.5 points, with 4 rounds left to play. Moving on to the U.S. Junior, we'll start with the key win by Christopher Yu against Jason Liang. This one started off with a Taimanov Sicilian, as Christopher plays a very trendy line bishop e3, queen to f3, and he showed some nice preparation here as he was in his book for quite some time in this game. After castles, rook to d2, this might have been the first move out of book. Here black plays f5, a very interesting move, looking to control the e4 square. White takes on f6, rook takes f6, and now bishop to e4. Engines actually didn't like this move. White's idea was to provoke d5 and bring the bishop back to d3, putting a lot of pressure on the e-pawn to follow. But apparently after b4, black is actually doing well. The key tactic here being that if white plays something like knight e2, black has queen to a5, and if white tries to defend the pawn of king to b1, then there's this key trick b3 in the position, where black hits the rook and of course threatens queen takes a2, which is a devastating meeting threat. So this was black's chance actually to possibly even get an advantage, but this was missed by both players. Queen to c7 played. Now takes, rook d1, rook d8. Again, black probably should play d5, but of course didn't want to leave the e-pawn backwards. However, to rook to d8, white's position is still very nice, as he just has so much pressure against black's structure in the center. Now queen to e1, nice move from Christopher. If rook takes f4, white has rook takes d7. Nice tactic. Takes, queen takes e6 check. White gets rook takes d7 next move, and black's position collapses. And after queen to e1, white's ready to bring the queen in somewhere to e5, for example, or after knight to e4, queen e3, white's pieces start to take over. So rook f7 played, knight to e4. Once again, if you take on f4 here, now there's knight to c5, followed by taking on e6 and using the pin along the d file. Once again, white breaks through. So queen c7 was played, now knight to g5, queen to e4, hitting the mate on h7, g6, g3, white is just in total control here. Knight c6, rook to d6, and this led to a quick finish. At this point, white has a lot of ideas like h4, h5, piling up on the d-pawn, and so forth. Black played rook to f6 here, allowing a very nice finish from Christopher, as he finds the brilliant queen takes c6. Sacrificing the queen is after d takes c6, rook takes d8. White is winning all of the material back with interest. For example, king g7. Either rook to d7 simply wins the queen back, and white will have an extra knight in the endgame. Or in the game we saw rook to f8, but now rook takes f8, king takes f8, then knight takes e6, white gets the queen, completely winning endgame here as well. Of course, on queen takes c6, if queen takes c6, then white simply takes this one, once again using the pin on the d-file, and once again white is left with an extra piece in this endgame. So very, very nice win from Christopher, as he gets the sole lead in this section with 4 out of 5. His first key rival, Justin Wang, can only draw his game today against Balaji. And the second co-leader going into this round, Andy Woodward, ends up losing this game to Grandmaster Andrew Hong. Quite a nice game by Andrew here as he faces the Catalan. And according to Andrew, it seems like his opponent was actually caught in the opening here after knight to c3. It's a very theoretical line in the Catalan. Black takes on c4. And this move might have been missed by Andy in his preparation, or at least he started spending a lot of time here, likely not remembering what he was supposed to do. According to the engines, knight to d2 is probably the way to go for white hitting the pawn. Black might play something like knight b6, e4, and white has some nice compensation for the sacrifice pawn in the form of the strong center. If queen takes d4, then there's a tactic here. With bishop to e3, hitting the knight on b6. White has other moves as well, such as knight to f3, for example, might even be stronger, as white just gets a huge initiative here. Instead, white plays a move knight to e5, and this is a mistake because black can take on e5, and white may have been counting on de, hitting the queen and of course the knight on f6, but the problem is that after knight to d5, e4 looks like white is winning a piece. Black has the nice trick knight to b4, hitting the queen on c2, and here black is able to keep the extra material, and of course has a big advantage. So after takes, white takes with the bishop on e5, but now knight to d5, and black definitely gets a very, very comfortable game here with the extra pawn. b3, takes, and now b4. Interesting decision by Hong in order to actually give back the pawn but mobilize his pieces. The engines do like knight to b4 here for black, or move like queen to b6. But black's solution in the game also quite interesting. He gives back the pawn, the bishop d7, he's able to mobilize queen b7, queen c8. And this endgame objectively is equal according to the engines, but does end up being very, very difficult for white to play it. Bishop d6, takes, rook comes down to c2. Now rook dc1 might have been the only way to hold the balance. So we see knight to c4, bishop to b5. And this deals nicely with the threat of takes, and knight to b6. This black here can go rook to b8. For example, rook a6, followed by taking on e2. In black's light square bishop is of course going to be very, very strong. So instead we saw knight takes a5, which ends up being possibly the decisive mistake of the game. Bishop to e4, and I think white can still hang on here, rook to c3, and then rook takes a5 or knight takes a5 is a better version. That said, black is still doing well. Instead we saw knight takes a5 immediately, bishop takes e2, rook to e1, and now g5. Very, very nice move by Andrew Hong here. watch out for this pawn later in the game, as he takes space on the king side. Bishop e4, rook to b2. The problem for white is that all the pieces are tied down, defending each other, whereas black's pieces are very, very active. Rook c1, rook a6. Check, rook c5. Now the knight comes into c3. Bishop b7. Black repeats once, bishop c6. Now bishop to d3, looking to infiltrate with knight e2 check. And of course knight takes d4. So here, Woodward tries d5. Black simply takes this one. Bishop takes d5. And now the rook swings over to f6, and all of a sudden it turns out white cannot defend the f-pawn, and of course white is just in huge, huge trouble here. The game concluded in a nice fashion. Bishop h1, g4, very, very nice move by black, actually locking in white's king and threatening ideas like knight e2 check, king to g2, and then bishop to e4, which would win the bishop on h1. Knight c4 was cried, but check, rook to c2, simple move, pinning the knight on the c-file. Rook e1, now knight to d4, hitting f2. White tried knight e5. Black could take the exchange, of course, but Andrew finds the most decisive solution, takes on f2 with check, king to g1. Now knight e2 check, rook takes e2. Once again, you could just take the rook. Black is completely winning, but he actually has even stronger. Rook f1 check, king to g2. And now bishop e4, very, very nice finish. Black has already sacrificed one piece for this attack. Now sacrifices the second. If rook takes, then of course there's rook down to f2 with a very, very nice mate. Said why try knight f3, the only other possible move, but now simply rook 6 takes f3 with the same mate after rook e4, rook f2. But otherwise rook f2 is a mate threat due to the double check anyway. And of course here white had to resign. So very, very nice win by Andrew Hong, as he himself moves to 3 out of 5. It is only a point behind the leader, Christopher Yu. Next up, we have the U.S. Girls Junior, and this was definitely the key game of the round between Omia Vidyarthi against the leader, Jasmine Su. Here, Omia starts with an anti-Grunfeld line with an early h4, definitely a very, very sharp position. And she managed to get an advantage out of the opening here. After g3, bishop to g2, knight c6. According to the engines, white could even just take here, play that position, playing against the double pawns. Said she castles, and a4, and here black is actually able to get into the game. And in fact, this one was very, very unclear, especially after white's play e3 and f4. This is quite ambitious, playing on the king side, taking a lot of space. But in fact, black does get some counterplay here, especially with the knight using this nice g4 outpost. Knight b5 now played, and here black makes a serious mistake, queen to d3, allowing rook a3 with tempo. Possibly Jasmine overlooked this one as white hits the queen and defends the g-pawn, and black's queen is forced to go backwards. So of course black would have been better off just retreating right away, looking for f6 ideas, and then actually apparently black would have a very decent game. Instead we see queen to c2, knight d6, knight d4, queen c4, and now a very serious mistake from black, f5. Apparently knight f5 here, and black is actually doing totally fine, challenging the knight on d6, and of course putting lots of pressure on white's king side. After f5, white just takes on passant, and the problem for black is if she takes back with one of her pieces, then the g6 pawn is going to hang. Here, instead of queen takes g6, where queen takes d6, black can actually take this piece. White would start with knight takes c8, and then take on g6 with a winning position. If rook takes f6 covering g6, then white can take on c8 with a nice game, or even go knight e8, and take on g7, and then black's dark squares around the king are going to be a problem. Instead, after ef6, black tries queen takes d6, but now f takes g7, king takes g7. Very strong move from Omia, b4, opening up the long diagonal for the dark sword bishop, which is now a very strong and unopposed piece. Of course, if black takes this one, white can either play bishop to b2, but I believe rook to d3 is the strongest here, followed by bishop to b2, and black is going to be collapsing on the long diagonal. So after b4, black tried e5. But now takes, rook c3, bishop a3, all of white's pieces coming in. Bishop to d6 here, king went back to g8. Nice finish here from white, rook takes c8 check, with the exchange sacrifice, followed by queen takes b7, where white is hitting the rook and threatening queen h7 mate. Black has no defense here without giving up all her pieces, and of course she had to resign. So big win for the section by Omia, as Jasmine slows down. And now there's 3 players within a half point of Jasmine too. One of those players being the top seed, I am Alice Lee. It was, of course, going into the tournament a big favorite, but has struggled so far, entering the day with an even score 2 out of 4. Today she faced Chloe Ga, and we saw Queen's Gambit accepted. With black possibly misplaying the opening, as white does get quite a nice endgame from the get-go. After takes a4, black goes b4, maybe knight bd2 here would have been a better approach. Or after knight e5, knight to d2, followed by knight d3, knight c4. Seems like white is definitely getting some edge here. As we saw in the game, bishop f3 and knight d3, Alice continues very naturally here, but e4, e5, and black is actually able to equalize in this one for some time. However, things change a bit later here. After bishop b5 takes, black decides to take with the a-pawn. Probably a serious mistake. I think rook takes was better. Black's idea, of course, was that she didn't want to give up the c4 square to white's knight. But after e takes b5, the issue is that white's passed a-pawn becomes very, very strong here. So knight b3, rook to c1, and now king f1 unpinning, takes on f2. White goes a6, black trades off a pair of rooks, knight c5, a7, and this pawn isn't promoting, black can blockade it, but rook a5 is the issue. And Alice is able to pick up an extra pawn, as black has to deal with this a-pawn. So king c6 takes king e3, and eventually the rook does go to b8 and to h8. The players get this endgame, which is actually very, very close in terms of being either a win for white or a draw. There was some chances for black to hold this one. b5 check, king to c7, rook h8, knight c5. Now white's b-pawn is going to be lost, but Alice manages to pick up the h-pawn on the king side. And this is where the situation was quite critical here, as black is able to get some counterplay in this position. For example, knight e6, knight f4 right away would have been a better try, and definitely giving black some chances. We saw king to c4, knight f5, knight e6, rook h8. And here black possibly missed a draw with rook d3 check first, followed by king f2, rook d2 check, and then either king to g3 or king f1. Either way, the knight comes to f4. It seems like black would have very, very nice counterplay here. Instead, Chloe started with knight f4, but now white gives this annoying check on c8, king to b3, g3, and just like that, black is losing coordination. If rook to d3 check, king to f2, the knight is forced to drop back, king e2 for example, and here the rook is kind of stuck. Black needed to put the king on b4 so that they could play rook a3 in this line, and then there would still be some chances. But here the rook is simply forced to go back, and white should be able to convert rook c6, rook e8, going after the g7 pawn, and so on. In the game we saw g3, knight e6, but now rook c6, knight f8, h4, and at this point white is simply winning. Black doesn't have any counterplay for the pawn. White just has a better position, extra pawn, black's king is cut off, and it's just a matter of technique from here. Now h5, Alice finds a very nice winning idea here after rook e8 and rook to e7, simply trading off the rooks or offering a rook trade. If black were to take this one, and after it takes, the issue is white will come back with knight to f5, and from here there's nothing black can do actually to stop the very nice combination knight takes g7. Very typical trick in the endgame, one that's really useful to know, but absolutely decisive here. For example, king to c6, white will take on g7, knight takes g7, h6, and the point is that this knight, it just can't stop white's h-pawn from promoting. No way to get back in time. So in view of that, of course black does not want to trade the rooks, goes rook d3 check and rook a3, but now white takes on g7. Now it's 2 pawns up, and of course this h-pawn is very strong. Black gave a couple more checks here, but the result was no longer in doubt. King to h5, avoiding the last possible trick, rook h1 mate. Never too late to blunder into a mate, but king h5 here, and this was met with resignation. It's not white's king is simply coming up, and then of course the h-pawn is going to promote. So huge win from Alice as she gets to a plus score for the first time in the event, and is now just a half point out of first place.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe.